very much everyone for coming to the first event of the Manchester Surveying Union this year. This is our first public debate, of which we'll be doing every Thursday at 5 o'clock in the space room. So thank you all very much for coming. So the motion before the House today is this House will leave the EU. We have representatives speaking for proposition to that is Stephen Woolfe, UKIP MDU for the North West, and Douglas Cochran, who's European debating finalist in the European Championship and graduate of law and international relations. Big round of applause. We have speaking beside opposition. Unfortunately, we've got apologies from both Julie Ward and Peter Warren. Unfortunately, Julie Ward's plane gets into relate from Strasbourg, and Peter Warren has a bereavement in the family, and both can try to stay. But very valiantly, for the side of opposition, we have Calum Young, who's a PhD student in European law and is based from the University of Sheffield, and Sean Taylor, graduate in law from the University of Leeds, and a shot class European law debater. Big round of applause. So, without any further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker from side proposition, Stephen Woolfe, to start the debate.
Here, here. Well, thank you very much, Declan. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the University of Manchester Debating Society for allowing me to get here alive without having to be strung up as I've come through the door. I've seen that many occasions. Although, having looked at the number of hands, I know that I've got a really tough job about me today. I just wondered, Mr. Chairman, if I could beg your leave and allow myself to take the jacket off, because I'm feeling a little bit underdressed, and actually it's very, very warm. I want to talk a little bit about why I believe that we should leave the European Union. To many of you may not know that actually the grounds here at the university, or more I should say, the BMW and car parking companies over there, was where my grandmother and my mother and aunt and the rest of the family lived. It was on Rosamond Place. It was knocked down, and they built the dual carriageway part of the university. I grew up in Ross Side, not far from here. Some of you may be living in there in student digs. I actually won a scholarship to go to a school on Alexander Road, which is called St. Bede's. For me, when I was growing up, in an area in the background that I had, one of the things that I found incredibly important was the fact that we didn't have very much, but my parents used to say, and my mum in particular, we don't have much, we can give you an education, we can read for you, we can give you books. And that's what I did, and I was lucky, I was fortunate. I won a scholarship there at St. Bede's, I then went on to university, studied law, I went to a barrister, I was the first person ever to get to university from my family. But during the time that I was studying my A-levels, I used to go to the library. And in the library at Manchester, many of you may see the cross and also the plaque for something that I hold particularly dear and very important. And that is the Peterloo Massacre. The Peterloo Massacre is where we saw children and men and women dying, simply because they stood up against the elites in this country because they wanted something vital and important, and that was the vote. It wasn't the first time that people had died in this country because they wanted something important of how they decided their lives. Certainly from the times of Cromwell, moving up through the levellers and the diggers, people had risked their lives simply for asking for the vote. In London, women stood up and were beaten by our own police officers simply for asking for the vote for women. And for me, the essential element of democracy, the idea that you in this room, that my family, the people out there in campaigns all across the country looking at the streets that we have and the people living on them should be able to hold their leaders to account, their elected representatives to account, that you should know them, that the laws that they make, you should hold them true, that they should not be able to have taxes in this country without you being able to elect them, is essential for a healthy democracy. In my view, my experience when I was a university student, my first days as a law student going to Brussels, was that was not the case. The very nature and the structure of the European Union does not allow yourself to have elected representatives, even though you might call myself an elected representative, the opportunity to make the laws on your behalf, or even get rid of me if you don't like those laws. For me, that essential nexus between you, the people, and the elected politicians has gone with this institution. And I'm not alone. When I was growing up, I used to read the books of a person I found wholly dear, an incredibly great brain, and a really moral person of that of Tony Benn. Both in his books arguments of socialism and in arguments of democracy, he made it absolutely clear that he believed the European Union institutions was about withdrawing and removing the opportunity for democracy from the people and handed it in to unelected dictators, in the view of him, the administrators in the Commission and the Council. And indeed, in the very short period of time that I've been an MEP, I mean, I only really got involved in UKIP 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, is that in the position that I have, I see that on a daily basis. I feel like I'm constantly being moved around because they don't want you to actually sit down and think about what they're doing. You're told to go to meetings. The voting rolls are literally pretty scary. I hope that many of you get the opportunity to go to the Parliament on a day when they will have 1,000 amendments voted through, because there will be images to yourself of the old communist days, the old black and white pictures of the communists when they said, shall we vote for Amendment A? 1,000 hands go up. These are not in buttons. These are not recorded. This is actually how it works. And you will see hand after hand, literally 5 hands every minute going up through all the kind of amendments that go through. There is no time to rationally understand the legislation that the Commission has created, or even a way of actually changing that. So for me, it's vital for you to understand that I believe in democracy connects ourselves with a sovereign state with its own parliament, and that this institution doesn't have it. And secondly, that even those who are elected like myself do not have the nexus between yourselves and the people, do not draft the legislation, have no opportunity really to amend it, and the power lies in the hands of the commissions. It is a fact, and that is something that you have to consider. But there is also a second argument, and I'm just wondering, having not put my clock on what sort of timing we've got, I've only got 1.5 minutes to talk about the economics. And it's very important for yourselves at the beginning of your careers, when you're looking to the future, when you're seeking the hope and aspirations of where you want to be, that this isn't simply about saying, I like my friends in Europe, I have relationships, as I have done in the past, with people from those countries. It is not about the people in those countries. We are a global nation, and we should open our hearts, up and spirits to the rest of the world. The reason this union was created, and in many ways is summed up by people like Lord Hannay, who was a funder of the organisation that's going to be here today, is they said, with all the difficult times that this country faced after 1945 up to 1973, it was dismal, it was miserable. There were union strikes, we had lights going out. But across the water, they thought that was the best place. We needed to join them, they felt, for the future. But it was the very time that the European Union, as it then was starting to decline. GDP has moved from 40% to 20%. By 2050, it will be 15%. It's 0.1% GDP now. There is 25% unemployment in Portugal, 27% unemployment in Greece. We see that people's living standards across Europe declining, the highest rates of suicide, people's families being split up because they have to get to planes to come and work here or go to Germany. This is the union's economic failure because the structures of this union has not allowed countries to be free to invest in their own people because the decisions are made by unelected professionals in the European Commission. So for you, ladies and gentlemen, I would rest on the motion that you need democracy and your economic liberalism to be here in this country for yourselves to satisfy your dreams and aspirations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much there. I'll invite Calum Young, the first speaker for opposition to this case.
We inside opposition are not going to defend the EU and claim that it's some sort of perfect, glorious union to which we all must hold allegiance. There are problems with it. There are things wrong with it. There are things that we would very happily change if we had a magic fix the EU wand. We would say that it is a body capable of reform, Is it a body which has progressed and improved over time, and overall the UK benefits greatly from its membership of that organisation, and it is a membership to be continued and upheld and fought for in the public sphere. That's why I'm essentially here at the last minute, not quite dressed for it, because I believe in that as a general, particular principle. I'm essentially going to talk to you a little bit about what the EU gives us, why decision-making in some areas is better made on EU level in a way that's very helpful for everyone, and deal a little bit with some of the previous speakers' comments. So, as I started off by pointing out, the EU isn't perfect. I really like it, and even I admit that to be true. The previous speaker made great gains, great arguments along the lines of pointing out the democratic deficit. I would point out that the longer the body he serves in exists, the longer the EU Parliament exists, it has gained and claimed more democratic powers for itself. The Lisbon Treaty, which came into force in 2010, was a boon for European democracy in that it handed more powers to the European Parliament, more powers to the people elected by you. We would greatly encourage this process, and we'd say that it continues ever still. The election of Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission President, selected by the groupings in the European Parliament, was another step forward for democracy within the EU. We would say that that's great. We would say that it's not necessarily perfect, but nor is the democratic deficit fundamentally unsolvable. And it remains, the EU isn't something that's done to us. It's a decision-making body which we participate in, which we send representatives to, which our leaders speak in, where our leaders advocate our positions within this union. We can talk about altering the balance of power within that towards the Parliament, away from commissioners or away from the European Council. But we don't necessarily have to leave that, merely due to the fact that it's not perfect, when we gain so much from that. A little bit on the economics. So in talking about the economics of the EU, it's notable that Mr. Woolfe didn't necessarily reference how the UK is harmed from this, merely mentioned that Portugal and Greece suffer high unemployment. Firstly, we would say that that might be something to do with the large economic global crisis that affected everyone. But even if you say it's down to the EU, and specifically down to the euro, the UK leaving the EU wouldn't change that. It's not going to fall apart and magically vanish if we leave it. These structures will remain. And if he wants to help alleviate the people of Portugal and Greece and Spain from any problems they may face, we would say that we are better off inside the EU, participating in this democratic process and contributing our voice towards the improvement of the EU. We feel that would be quite useful. So, essentially the rest of my speech is going to be a little bit about economics, a little bit starting stuff that John's going to finish, about what happens in a post-EU world. Because we heard very little from the previous speaker about the UK's relationship with this large economic body that would still be there. So we'd say that there are a couple of options. Either we don't necessarily have any particular relationship with them. We would say that that's exceptionally harmful for our economy. Because as a non-EU member country, we could potentially face quite serious tariffs, massive decrease in trade. It would become much harder for the car companies and the other companies that he referenced to trade with the EU, to sell the products we make, to employ British citizens, to employ you in the future or now, if they faced prohibitively high barriers to trade with the EU.
A point of information.
Sure, yes.
Do you think it's going to be possible, or actually advisable, for the Germans to stop selling their cars to Britain, or the French to stop selling their wine, or the Italians their fashionable clothes? Do you really think they're going to put the tariff barriers up that would harm their own industries?
Not necessarily. Even if these tariff barriers don't remain up, and we adopt a model similar to Switzerland or Norway, there are very serious problems with both of these models. Firstly, in that they have to obey rules they have no say in making, quite a large democratic problem there. John's going to elaborate a bit upon that. But secondly, it doesn't necessarily work to our advantage. We don't necessarily get the lovely pick and mix deal that everyone would like to happen, that we get now. For example, Norway implements more EU law than the UK does currently, in order to be able to trade tariff-free with the EU. I'd say that's not necessarily a likely outcome if we have just stormed out of the Union and demanded a very good deal. A tactic we may be seeing quite a lot of, depending on tonight's results. Moving on to then Switzerland. Switzerland have essentially a set of very complicated agreements dealing each individual EU issue. But it doesn't give them access. Firstly, Switzerland does not have the same access to the services market that we do. They face tariffs, they face barriers to trading services in the EU. And given we live in the UK, a mostly services-based economy, we would say that would be very harmful for the UK economy for us to face these barriers. Secondly, there is the deal organised by the EU and Switzerland, but you have to take it all or take nothing. An example is the recent Swiss referendum on introducing quotas on EU migrants. Something we would say would be quite likely in a post-EU Britain. What happens then? They've breached one of the things. There is no pick and mix membership. Before they've even implemented this policy, Switzerland has lost access to the Horizon 2020 fund, 80 billion euros worth of money for research, for universities. Swiss students have been cut off from the Erasmus scheme. They've been disallowed from participating in this thing, which broadens minds and gives British students great possibilities to go abroad. Furthermore, if they actually even implement this policy, they will lose complete access, and the tariff barriers will go up, and we would face all of these huge economic harms for leaving the EU. So because it can be improved, can be more democratic, and economically we do gain a lot for being in the EU, we should essentially continue our membership and improve it a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Calum, there. I invite Doug to continue the case beside his position. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for being here, and thanks to the MDU for organising tonight's debate. I will not presume to try and persuade you as to how you ought to vote in a 2017, 2016, or indefinitely postponed referendum if the Tories don't win next time. My invitation to you tonight is to consider the issues, to have a think about them. I know and I can see from the vote that most of you are probably on the pro-EU side. My invitation to you tonight, however, would be not to consider the European Union, as I think so many of us do, and I certainly did for a long while when I was at university many, many years ago, as a cultural issue. Many of you will have seen the debates between Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage, and the manner in which our attitudes toward the European Union are shaped and conducted in the media and in public space are often by cultural association. We see someone who rails against the Westminster elite with a cigar in one hand and a pint in the other, and some people, not very many in this room, say, yeah, that's my sort of guy. Sorry.
Sorry. I don't drink and smoke, so I'm the opposite.
And then there are other people who are meant to be a bit more cosmopolitan, a bit more with it, a bit more wealthy, a bit more London-centric, who are meant to associate, or were meant to used to associate with Nick Clegg before he trebled tuition fees. I'm actually so old, I remember when it was cool to be a university student and support the Liberals Democrats. My point to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is a political institution. And the second thing I would try and persuade you to do is not only not to associate your feelings with the European Union based on cultural affinity, but equally to some extent not even based on the outcomes it generates. What Mr. Woolfe has done in his speech is to say, and to set out at length, the manner in which the European Union is not a democratic body. And the response we've had, quite honestly, from the opposition is not really to contest the fact, but to suggest that reformism is the way in which it can be made more democratic. But the difficulty here is that this is not some sort of infant fever that's taken on the European Union. This institution has been with us in the United Kingdom for somewhere near 40 years. We're still waiting for a properly democratic body, and one isn't coming. And these are not minor problems with the democratic structure of the European Union. The workhorse of the Union is the Commission, which is unelected, a group of bureaucrats. The European Parliament cannot initiate its own legislation 40 years since our membership.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reformist principle is the democratic one. If you want to reform institutions, you have to have the power to do so. There is no incentive for the European Commission to surrender its powers. There is every reason for those powers to continue growing. So let's deal, if we may, with the economic analysis of the European Union. And I think, if I may, with trade as with immigration, two of the major things that the European Union brings us, I think it's important to remember two things when we address both of these questions. One is that these are not yes or no questions. Trade is not a yes or no question. We're not going to either trade with the world or not trade with the world. And in today's globalised world that you'll hear about in all of your first-year politics textbooks and things, there's lots and lots of trade going on. It's the rebuttable presumption for the way liberal democracies conduct their economic affairs. And it is folly to suggest that if the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union, that the result would be a massive raft of protection. But what's more important is that trade would be a democratic issue if, in fact, the UK left the European Union. We could decide, as England did all throughout the 19th century, we could debate the merits of free trade agreements, which we are not able to do now here democratically in the United Kingdom. Currently, the European Commission is conducting in secret negotiations for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the United States. There is no democratic check to speak of in terms of the implementation of this agreement. And what's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is that, as you may have already observed, we do trade with America already, despite it not being part of the European Union. So there is no great magic to this political institution, which suddenly showed everyone that buying and selling stuff might be possible. What is unique about the European Union is that it goes beyond what we think of as free trade, i.e. buying and selling stuff without tariffs. What you'll see when the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership finally gets implemented, probably too late for you to have any say on it, is that it's the non-tariff barriers that are the ones that get brought down. Environmental regulations, labour regulations, consumer protection, much higher here in Europe than it is in the United States. And you will not be able to hold your representatives to account over the issue. You will not be able to scrutinise them. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just the formal mechanisms of the European Union that are deficient democratically, as my partner Mr. Woolfe has outlined. It's the fact that there isn't a political culture. You will experience student democracy during your time here at Canada. All universities have unions, and they have the simulacrum of elections. But we all know they aren't proper democracies. Let's say you wanted to get rid of your MEP. How would you do it? Their position on the list is decided for you by political parties. Political parties that don't campaign on a European level, that don't publish manifestos on a European level, except very milk and water platforms that say soccer and happiness are good things. Ladies and gentlemen, you have no ability to change the perspective and the orientation of the European Union. You remember that it was only recently we had some elections for the European Union. Do you remember what the issues in that election were? There weren't any. There were simply people in 27 different member states passing a vote of no confidence against the ruling governments of the time. Even if their reformist ideology could work, even if 40 years on we are just on the threshold of formal democracy, we do not even have a common language in which to conduct political discourse. This debate is not about Europeans and what we think of them. We say that we should relate to Europeans, and we should relate to other countries in a spirit of amity, and at least to some extent, a spirit of free trade. But ladies and gentlemen, it is a discussion about what the people of our country want to do with our own affairs. And we say that, like for the people of the European Union, like for our own people, that choice ought to be determined democratically. It is not now, and it cannot be in future with the European Union as it currently exists. And it's for those reasons I'd urge you to propose this motion. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, then. I invite John to finish the case side opposition.
Okay, so I'm going to basically talk about, again, the post-EU membership world, how it's a much worse place for us. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. And then I'm going to talk about some economic stuff. And if I've got time, some lovely discourse stuff, which is what debating loves talking about. Talking about things. So firstly, though, I'd just like to address a few things that were said by Doug. I mean, the idea that free trade agreements aren't discussed and voted on in the EU Parliament. I mean, ACTA was a free trade agreement that was discussed on in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament said no. So I think it seems strange to say that these things that are proposed by the Commission don't have to be approved by the Parliament, because they kind of have to be approved by the Parliament. That's kind of what the Parliament's there for. I also think it's incredibly strange to say that because we are politically apathetic towards the EU and our elections for the EU were a bit of a mess, it's the fault of the EU, rather than the fact that none of us care enough or read enough about the EU to understand the issues that are talked about. Calum, for example, lived in the Netherlands through a study programme that was helped by our EU membership, by the way. But what he tells me happened in the Netherlands was actually a pretty frank discussion about what the EU was doing, about how these free trade agreements were happening. So what I think is actually a bigger failing is the fact that the political parties here and our political establishment just doesn't know how to engage with the EU. I think that's probably actually a bigger failing on our part, rather than a failing of the EU. If we don't care about something, I don't understand how it's that group's fault that we don't care. I think that not quite. No, I'm still rambling a bit here. So I think that's incredibly strange. Also, about the trade doesn't just stop. Yeah, that's obviously true, right? At the point at which we leave the EU, trade doesn't just stop. And this is moving to the first thing we're going to discuss. However, Norway has a tariff imposed on it by France of 20% on its fish products, right? That which is a relatively significant part of the Norwegian export market, right? In return, Norway decided that they would tax French cheese by 400% as a screw you in return. But I think the example there, whilst it is slightly facetious, actually points out that it is not the case that you can leave the EU and not face any trade tariffs, right? And that is something that's really key in talking about this issue. It is just not possible for us to leave and face no repercussions, right? These repercussions are pretty damn significant, yeah.
Isn't it true that nations that are members of the EU have to sign on to the EU's own external tariff, which is often very high against developing nations and their agricultural exports?
Yeah, that is true. It's also, however, true that in the event that we leave, we firstly become subject to some of these tariffs ourselves, and that probably harms us pretty heavily as well. And also, secondly, we have an ability to actually argue against those things, for example. So we will vote against them for our seats on the Commission to say that we don't want these things. But we don't because we're incredibly self-interested. At the point at which nations are self-interested and we leave, we lose the ability to push forward our self-interest in those things, which is the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is specifically about the idea of our banking system. This is sounding incredibly thrilling, I'm sure, to all of you sitting here on a Monday, whatever afternoon it is, Thursday, talking about banking reforms. But, crucially, 75% of banking activity in Europe happens in the City of London, right? It's obviously a hugely important thing for our economy, for Europe generally. It's also a thing that's been increasingly regulated by Europe, very reasonably, around things to do with consumer protection, right? Because banks shouldn't be allowed to screw you over. Now, the thing that's happening around this is very important in that it's basically saying that if you want, as a bank, to operate in an EU country, you must meet these rules, right? You must meet the way that they do. Also, potentially in your home country. So, for example, German citizens at the moment are able to go and bank in Switzerland under Swiss banking rules, and there's not very much that can be done about it. That's being massively changed at the moment, to the point at which Swiss banks are having to consider adopting EU laws that the Swiss government has absolutely no say in making, right? This is where, again, it comes back to the issue of democratic deficit. At the moment, the people that we have in the Commission, because again, one thing, the Commission's agenda is set by the member states, right? The member states say to the people on the Commission what they want the agenda to be pushed towards. It's not the case that we have absolutely no say on what the Commission does, because we do. We tell them what we particularly want, we tell them the direction we'd like them to go, and they begin to push things through on that. And if it doesn't come up with something that we want, we can get our representatives to vote against that thing. In the event that we leave, we lose that influence. We have no ability to say to them, we want this thing to be done, that is in our interest. And we think that that is going to cause much more significant harms than they are talking about there. And finally, on this thing that Doug was talking about, the idea that don't just consider it on the debate about particular policies. Yeah, this debate is not about UKIP, right? The debate is not about how much we like or dislike UKIP in this room, right? That's not the point. One thing that is to be discussed, however, is that the political position in Europe dramatically affects us, right? The way that the parties in Europe vote within the European Parliament dramatically affects us. And if we are not able to put our political culture across, we're not able to put the political position of the British people across in these areas, I think that we will actually be substantially harmed in the way in which our interests are protected, in the way in which our representation is put forward. We'd also say that it's entirely plausible. In the event that we do leave the EU is not going to be particularly happy with us for doing that, right? Like, we don't think that it's particularly likely, in the event that we tell Europe, no thanks, that they're going to consider our interests. So one of the reasons why Norway's actually got a fair few of the things that it's asked for is because it's had incredibly amicable relations with the EU in the way in which it's implemented things. As mentioned by Calum, they've actually implemented even more than we have. But the reason that that's enabled them to have that relationship, at the point at which we've told them, no thanks, we don't like you, we think that it's incredibly unlikely we're actually going to get many of the nice benefits that the Gov are trying to say that they'll be able to get. I think that is a massive problem towards our future interests and the way in which we're going to be able to operate. So finally, and again, it was mentioned by Calum, but I think it's important to mention considering that we're in a university. The Erasmus program is one of the most amazing things that is done by the EU and its organisations. The way it enables students to go abroad, to study in other cultures, to learn from those other cultures, and to generally engage them. I think that is something that is clearly under threat in this situation when this happens. See the Swiss example, where at the point at which they start to opt out of various things, they lose the access to that. We think that the important thing to know with the EU as well is that European integration is something that culturally benefits Europe and benefits the UK, because it enables our exposure to these other countries to be much greater. We think that it enables our ability to engage with these countries on a cultural level to be improved. We think that that is something that changes both us and them for the better, because it enables you to go there to experience things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to experience in a much easier way and a much better way. And for those reasons, and the ramble I just had, I urge you to vote for yours.
Well, I think the problem with the premise of the question is that we would argue that history has shown that it actually has it is relatively, well, again, not necessarily easy, but doable to reform it. So I mean, in the event that we were in an institution that would never, ever, ever change, that would probably be a problem. But at the point at which we are in the institution as it exists, in the way in which we can alter things, in which we can have an input, and we have some support on things, for example, in the free movement with like Germany, the Netherlands, France, for example, all starting to move against some of the provisions of that. We don't think it is likely that that would be the case, and if it was, it wouldn't be the EU as we would be defending it. It would be a different organisation.
Yeah,
it's based in somewhere.
Yeah.
Any response?
Well, I mean, we've seen massive disengagement with Westminster politics as well. But even considering a situation where we don't particularly care about and the problems that causes, we agree. That is an issue, right? And it is something where the EU probably needs to do a lot better. But the benefits around the actual sort of financial benefits that it brings, around some of the security benefits that it brings, I mean, like the fact that we can influence some of the, influence an awful lot of this stuff, and the way in which, for example, it benefits us in terms of easier imports, easier exports, mean that the practical benefits of it are significant. And therefore, we think we can try and improve the democratic deficit. And even if the democratic deficit or the lack of engagement is still there, the financial benefits are so great that we should still be a part of those benefits. Even if it's a situation where people don't necessarily care, the amount of the financial difference it makes to them is one that we think is enough, basically.
No, it's a very valid point, and unfortunately most of my life I've actually been drinking healthy water without the EU ever telling Britain before we joined that we needed to have healthy water. I think we managed to try and develop that after the 18th century when people were dying of bucolic plague and all the rest of it. I think that there's a lot of health and safety standards which we've actually led the world on. The premise, though, is what you're saying is that just because we're a membership of the EU and we're not participating in those means that they come up with the best and the brightest and the greatest ideas and therefore we should have to take them on. I think that we have skilled people in this country, as is shown by all the technology. Indeed, here today, I'm probably going to see people who run companies, create science, go out and run law firms, get out there and do great things from this institution and others like it, that didn't necessarily need the European Union to tell them to do it or how to do it. We have a country and a structure that can do that. And I don't believe that we need to be tied up into something that, in my view, was a wonderful idea after the Second World War. But so was writing on paper. My colleagues who've been helping me here have never actually had to do what I did at the university, not have a computer. We just had paper in those days, and I didn't even want a shop phone. Actually, the Koreans are probably doing pretty well myself. We have Blackberries that have now gone out of fashion because Apple is technologically better. The European Union was an institution created in those. It's the Blackberry of its time. I want the country to move on to the Apple and look around the world globally and encapsulate and incorporate all peoples of the world and involve ourselves with trade with everyone. But we should be able to do it ourselves, linking up with those who have common values and ideas and share those.
Any response? So, it's not that we're saying that Britain isn't skilled or competent. We're saying we think it's quite a nice place. I came back to live here for quite some time. Quite like it. But the reason why these regulations exist is that it is more helpful for British companies and British businesses and British people for there to be one common European standard. To use the sausage example, if you're a sausage making company in the UK and you are trying to sell in foreign countries and you have to deal with 28 different regulatory standards for sausages, this is quite difficult for you because you have to produce 28 different types of sausage. If there is one EU level standard for sausages, you can simply churn out more of the same type of sausages and sell them more easily to various European countries. This applies across the scale of business, across companies. And it's mostly stuff that is tedious, which makes it quite hard to include in a rousing public speech. Mostly, if Germany says that a wire has to be red and France says a wire has to be blue, it's very hard to care about that. But if you think about it for 5 minutes, having one standard, be it red or blue, no real meaningful difference, makes it a lot easier for a lot of people to do business, earn money, and employ citizens. Like, this is the fundamental problem with the EU, is it's tedious to talk about, but very helpful.
I think the other thing that I'd add in terms of how treaties can be formed, I mean, we can, for example, make a trade agreement with China. However, we're a country of 60 million people. They're a country of 1 billion people. They are in a massively stronger position in terms of the way in which their trade is done. When you're part of an economic union of 500 million people, you have a lot more sway at the negotiating table when you're talking about the things in which you can provide for them, right? You can provide them more as a body, both in terms of access to markets and in terms of access to these various different services, these various different goods. So I think it is just a obvious point that when you are a larger body, it is much easier for you to get a beneficial trade deal than it is if you are a much smaller group. In the way that, for example, we think it is plausibly true that, for example, Scotland negotiating by itself with the US is going to get a less beneficial deal than the European Union as a whole negotiating with the USA around a trade deal. Then that, for example, when we talk about what financial benefits does it provide, the ability to more cheaply produce your products because you don't have to produce loads of different variants to meet those different standards, and also that we can get better agreements as a part of a larger body. Those are the financial benefits. They're not interesting, but they're important, and they're what make a difference to companies on a daily basis.
Thank you very much.
By voting for one, by participating in this scheme. The alternative we're faced with isn't the disappearance of the common agricultural policy. It's a common agricultural policy without British input. The common agricultural policy will still exist. Indeed, given that Britain has been one of the most consistent advocates for a less protectionist, fewer subsidising common agricultural policy, us departing from that discussion would probably most likely hand greater amounts of power to the French, who have been in favour of the sort of protectionist, objectionable common agricultural policy, which I think you and several other people I know are definitely here, dislike.
And a change in that would really screw British farmers. A change in the common agricultural policy to be even more protectionist, particularly in favour of, again, as we say, the French farming industry, would be even worse for
the British farming industry. So yeah, the common agricultural policy is a bad thing, but it is a bad thing that is limited by our influence. Without our influence, it becomes even worse. Like that's another thing of not exactly a rousing row. It's not as bad as it could be, but it is it is a genuine point that not as bad as it could be makes a massive difference to a large number of people.
And so to return to the Swiss example, as part of the bilateral deal, the Swiss government has to accept EU agriculture policies without any say in making them in order to have the sort of tariff-free trade that greatly benefits their economy. So you don't get the sort of deal where you just get to pick the bits you like and pick the bits you don't like. It comes as a package.
With a bag of sweets here, having to decide which sweets you like. You really like the red one, they like the blue, there's the green one. And you've got to negotiate to find out the one that you want. You might end up with a licorice one that none of us really like at all. And that's really what the European Union is absolutely like. What you do is then the debating chambers and the Commission and the Council, you have a large number of people trying to get what they all want together, and it ends up being the lowest common denominator. And the point I want to pick up in terms of farming, because so far I think you've done a very eloquent and decent debate so far, but on common agricultural policy, that is one of the principles and parts of the European Union that absolutely everybody agrees is a complete disaster. The poorest people in this country and across Europe are paying £300 to £400 per year more for their food basket because we pay a third of our budget in the common agricultural policy. It is the largest proportion of what you spend our £55 million a day on. Do you think it's right that the poorest people in this country should be prohibited from getting cheaper food across the globe, where a lime from somewhere in South America has an 18% tariff on it to be able to put into your gin and tonic or vodka that you'll be celebrating in your party later, just so that you can subsidise a farmer in Spain who gets a subsidy to have a cheap food here? It is wrong in principle to make people suffer at higher prices just because you want to stay in the European Union because it feels good. It is not wrong.
Yeah, amen to that. I would just underline one of the points Stephen made there. I think the opposition, in keeping with the rather apologetic tenor they've had in defending the European Union throughout tonight's debate, have now conceded that common agricultural policy is a bad thing. Let's not deceive ourselves. Common agricultural policy on the European Commission's own website, you can see this today, it is 30% of the entire EU budget, and there's another 11% for aid to rural areas that's not covered as part of the CAP. This is the big kahuna. This is what the European Union, to a large extent, is all about. And what the opposition contend in this debate is they concede all the harms that we've outlined common agricultural policy brings, but they say that we need to be involved in order to ameliorate the effects of it. Well, there's two quick responses to that. One is that the second we're outside, we can set our own trading relations with states around the world. We also get the benefit of the money we pay to Brussels, which is about 1 working week in every year for the average EU citizen. And we can do what we like with that. Hopefully we won't vote to subsidise our own farmers, but if we needed to, we could do that. And we could throw out the politicians who tried to. But more to the point, if France and if Portugal and Estonia and the other European nations truly wish to have a political union in which they subsidise their own agriculture, then I don't think any of us can legitimately object. I think, however, once we, as the United Kingdom, as a very successful, large, prosperous state, show what states outside the European Union can do, I think other European states will follow our example.
I mean, the crash of the financial sector, we think, is something that was probably going to happen with or without EU regulation. I think the fact that it imploded in America almost entirely, and the Federal Reserve had to bail it out to an outrageous extent, I think doesn't necessarily support the idea that just because you have your own independent currency means it's not going to happen. We also think it's entirely plausible, for example, that the situation in places like Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece, Ireland would have been an awful lot worse had they not had the European Central Bank willing to give them massive amounts of money to keep their economies afloat. I think that's the problem. That it only works at the point in which you're a country that is rich enough to protect itself against that from happening. So I think America is rich enough to protect itself when its banking sector goes wrong. I mean, just rich enough, but rich enough to protect itself when its banking sector goes wrong. I think that's not necessarily true of an awful lot of places, and that actually the umbrella security that the European Central Bank can provide is potentially a huge benefit to countries within Europe. So I think, again, I don't think you can blame the financial crisis on Europe. I think that's probably a little bit unfair.
The crisis that caused in Europe was essentially part of monetary and fiscal failure by the nation states who profitably spent more than they had by borrowing in the international markets. When I was growing up, my grandmother had a particular important thing, is that we don't spend what we couldn't earn. You know, we didn't go out and borrow. We didn't go to the banks. In fact, we couldn't really go to banks at that time because we didn't have the sort of lending that came into Britain until the late 80s. You had to make sure that you lived within your means. But what happened in Europe when you knew that Greece was not at the right economic standards to enter the European Union, and Portugal and Ireland very similar, was that those countries spent more in their economies trying to bribe their own electorates that they were the best political party by giving them more benefits, more donors, more hospitals, more schools, and a whole load of other things that they thought was useful, but actually a way of spending more than they could actually afford. And they went and did that by going into the international markets. And you know what? If you're going to offer low interest rates and give an opportunity to the international markets, they're going to bite your hand off. Because they said, we will keep lending to Greece and Portugal and Spain and Italy and France because we know that all those countries together will bail them out if they go bust. And what happened? They were bailed out when they went bust. And my argument was, any bank that invested badly should have gone down. We should not have bailed out one single bank at all for the decisions they made, and we should not have had anyone bailing them out too. And the European Central Bank enabled that to happen. And people across Europe have suffered and will suffer for decades to come because of those disastrous decisions.
So we finish off the debate today with 2-minute speeches from each speaker, just provide a summary, and we'll end with a vote. So about the first speaker from the side of opposition, Stephen, to the debate.
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I thought they were really very insightful questions, and I can see there's a whole lot more. I'll stick around if anyone wants to ask more. John and Calum have set out a really very good debate for the opposition, and I think they did that extremely well. But I'm going to start with what Doug suggested. This debate is not cultural. It isn't about whether we like our friends in Europe or not. I hope to goodness that we do. We should have very good relationships with our friends. But this is actually a question about whether we should be friends with the whole world, not just the European Union. That is my belief. Growing up and going through university, my friends came from Malaysia and Singapore, the United States and South Africa, as well as on the trips I did on the trains throughout Europe, on the days that you used to be able to get 4 weeks and go off around there. This is about how we look at the world, because the time of the European Union was then, and we have to look forward to the future. We should be an all-inclusive country. When we look at immigration, we shouldn't be restricting it to European Union. It should be an open-door policy for the whole world with everybody treated equally. You cannot do that under the European Union. I share no fear if we leave the European Union because so many people have said that we've got options. Under the Lisbon Treaty, we will have 2 years in which we can negotiate our relationships on economic matters with other countries. Ella Stewart, the Labour MP, for Wolverhampton, I think, I could be corrected on that, has said, do you really think that the German manufacturing industry wouldn't enter into a free trade agreement immediately upon us leaving? They would. Because this isn't about EFTA, this is about modernity. Free trade arrangements now are the way forward. And we could, as the 7th largest economy, the 4th largest armed force in the world, with the 8th largest manufacturing industry, with the growth that's actually happening, and with the very intelligent and bright people, we would be recognised that we could actually trade with other countries across the globe. And I believe that they could do this once again, as we have done in the past. This is about going forward, not about the past. And for that reason, I commend this motion to the House. Thank you very much.
side opposition. Is it both of us that speak?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. I wish I was.
I'm on John then. I'll do it.
Just so I can keep pace. 1 second. Okay, so again, we think the debate has actually been very, very constructive and very, very good. But we just want to highlight one key thing that we think that's been very true of the proposition bench. They've highlighted loads of things that are bad about the EU that don't change in the event that we leave and actually affect us quite greatly if we do. So again, the common agricultural policy affects us whether we're in the EU or not, right? Our farming procedures are hurt by that because of our ability to compete with a subsidised industry, right? If we aren't a part of that and aren't getting those subsidies, we are hurt because we don't have them, right? And they can say as much as they like that we can trade with other people, we can make these agreements. But we just ask the question of how likely are they to invest the political capital in us versus accessing a much larger market that they can access more easily if they make an agreement with a larger bloc. We would posit that they're much more likely to invest their political capital and time in doing that into the larger zone that they can access and making those kinds of agreements. We also just think it is horrible some of the things that are done in terms of putting tariffs on poor countries' imports. We don't see any reason we also probably wouldn't do that, right? We can't just stand up there and pretend that our parliament will not pass things to protect our industry, because it obviously will do, right? Those and the bad things that are happening in countries outside of that will also happen, right? It is deplorable that is the case. It unfortunately is a political reality of that's how countries behave. And also just quickly, the idea that we shouldn't have bailed out European banks, I mean, that would have probably folded the world economy almost entirely if we'd allowed the entire banking sector of America, the UK, and most of Europe to collapse. I think that probably would have been a disaster. But we'll bypass that for the moment as to how terrible that would have been. So essentially we'd say there are lots of problems with the EU, but we think in the event that we leave, those problems stay, we have no ability to influence them, and they start hurting us in a much greater way than they do at the moment. And again, we can't alter them. So for those reasons, I urge you to oppose.
Thank you very much, John, there, and I invite Doug to finish with the case of side proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate this evening, you've heard from two speakers who've spoken at length and with great eloquence about the problems, the deep structural problems in the European Union. You've also heard from Stephen and myself, who actually they were doing something about it in terms of leaving. The opposition throughout this debate have shifted their case. They started saying that the European Union was democratic, then that it could be reformed to be democratic, then that it wasn't democratic, but that economic outcomes would be so great and so massive and so beneficial to us that we should stay anyway, regardless of the democracy. By the end of it, they shifted to say the European Union wasn't actually all that good after all, but we should stay in to save everyone from the French. It's not every day you get to be on this side of the house and be the cultural Europhiles in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that even if the United Kingdom were to adopt the position of Norway and Switzerland, which are apparently terrible countries to live in, and simply adopt the regulatory standards of the European Union, whilst maintaining our own democratic accountability over those regulatory standards and any free trade negotiations we entered into with the European Union, I don't think that posture would be so much to our disadvantage. We agree that the Common Agricultural Policy does much to impoverish not only the poorest people in our country, but many of the poorest people outside our country and outside the European Union altogether. And the response from the opposition is, well, we would make the same mistakes anyway, as an independent country, and that's possibly true. But this is what this debate is all about. Were we to make those mistakes, you and I could do something about it. We could write to MPs who have a real chance of losing their seats in constituencies that they hold, for which they are the constituency MP. We could lobby for change. We could ask political parties, we could join political parties or make new ones that have real and effective sway in a parliament that actually controls its own legislative apparatus. If we make those mistakes are ours as a democratic body, and we have the power of reform in our hands. They're waiting for reform to come. We bring power home to real democracy here in Britain. That's why we propose.